Well, hello again. Mr. Director, welcome.
Great, it's great to be here. Thank you very much, Suzanne.
I've been waiting for a year to have this conversation.
Me too. Considering where else I've been during that year, I've been looking forward to coming here.
Yes, I'm sure we'll talk all about that. I thought we might actually start with something very broad. You are someone who has spent the bulk of your career as a diplomat, and now you've been the director of the CIA for a couple of years now. I just want to ask you if you'd share with us sort of your look at the world right now. A very small question.
Yeah, well, first, it's hard to believe that I've been, had the privilege of being CIA director for almost 4 years now, too.
4 years, yes.
Certainly hasn't been dull, particularly this last year, as you said. I mean, I think one of the things that I take great pride in at the agency is that over the course of this past year, which has in many ways been dominated by two conflicts, one in the Middle East and one in Ukraine, each enormously important, is that we've managed to stay focused on long-range challenges, China being the biggest geopolitical challenge, I think, as all of you know as well as I do, that the United States faces, and the biggest intelligence priority for CIA, a revolution in technology, which is going to really shape the future of CIA as an intelligence service. So we put a lot of focus into that. Counterterrorism, to which we devote, considerable resources and maintain a very sharp focus, as Ayman al-Zawahiri discovered in what turned out to be a not-so-safe house in downtown Kabul a couple of years ago. And then, investing in our workforce as well. Again, something I've spent a lot of time in, supporting families, doubling the number of medical practitioners that we have in the foreign field. And most encouraging to me is that this past year we had the largest number of applicants to join CIA of any moment since just after 9/11. So that says something about the professionalism of all of my colleagues, in whom, as I said, I'm extraordinarily proud. But with all that backdrop and all of those long-range priorities, a lot of our attention and focus has been dominated by those two conflicts. Mm-hmm. I'll start with Ukraine and then move to the Middle East. I just got back from my 13th visit to Ukraine during the course of the war, which is, I think, a reflection of the priority that we attach as an agency to supporting Ukrainians against Russian aggression. President Zelensky, for whom I have great admiration, and despite all the burdens of his office, he has not lost his sense of humor. On my 10th visit, which was 5 months ago or so, he gave me a certificate entitling me to a free upgrade on the train from Poland to Kyiv. I think it's the same train and same seat, but it's a nice gesture. But I'm really proud of the record of the agency going back to the period before the war began, when I think we did what a good intelligence service has to do, which is provide early, accurate warning of the invasion that was to come. I remember being sent by the president to talk to President Putin in early November of 21, so several months before the invasion, and finding him utterly unapologetic about the sort of fairly graphic details that, I laid out at the president's direction about what we could see coming and what the consequences of that would be. And I'm proud of the work that CIA has done with our colleagues in the intelligence community to help the president build a strong coalition of countries to support Ukraine, to help the Ukrainians defend themselves, and then in kind of a novel innovation, to declassify some of our secrets, to put Putin in the uncomfortable and unaccustomed position of being on his back foot, I think, especially through the critical first year of the war. There's enormous challenges ahead, as the Ukrainians understand better than anyone. I would not underestimate Putin's singular fixation on controlling Ukraine and controlling its choices, but nor would I underestimate the courage and tenacity of Ukrainians, so long as we continue to provide strong support, not just at CIA, but across the US government and across our allies as well. Putin, in my experience dealing with him over many years, always thinks Americans have attention deficit disorder, and sometimes we demonstrate that, we move on to the next challenge. This is one of those cases where we have to demonstrate the strength of our support for Ukraine, because there's a lot riding on this, not just for Ukrainians, but for European security and for the basic proposition that big countries don't get to swallow up smaller countries just because they think they can. And I'm glad to talk more about that later on. On the Middle East, it's important to remember where this year started in a horrific terrorist attack which slaughtered 1,200 Israelis, took another 250 hostage. It's an issue that's consumed a lot of my time and attention and our agency's time and attention. Over the course of the last year, I always try to remember that the issue in Gaza for Israelis, for Palestinians, is not an abstraction. It's about human beings. It's about the hostages living in hellish conditions in tunnels beneath Khan Yunis and other parts of Gaza. It's about their families, amongst the bravest people I've ever known. It's about mothers and fathers in Gaza, the Gazan civilians who are caught in the crossfire and suffering enormously. It's about the humanitarian catastrophe that they face. I also try to remember that, what's at stake in Gaza is shaped by political will. In the end, it's not just about brackets and texts or creative formulas when you're trying to negotiate a hostage and ceasefire deal. It's about leaders, who ultimately have to recognize that enough is enough, that perfect is rarely on the menu, especially in the Middle East, and then you've got to make some hard choices and some compromises in the interests of a longer-term strategic stability as well, and in the interests of those human beings that I mentioned. Now we face the very real danger of a further regional escalation of conflict. The challenge that that we see in Lebanon today after 2 weeks in which Israel has had some very significant tactical successes. The risk of a further escalation between Iran and Israel, even though we don't assess, at least, that either of those two leaderships right now is looking for an all-out conflict, but there remains that risk. And so, it's really important, I think, as we try to navigate the very tense period ahead of us, to keep in mind that the bigger challenge, I think, is going to be to translate those tactical successes into an effective strategy that marries the use of force, which is really important, especially in dealing with despicable terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, but marrying it with good intelligence and ultimately smart diplomacy to try to produce a ceasefire to Israel's north, as well as what has been a very elusive ceasefire in Gaza after the success we had at the end of last year, which produced the release of 100 hostages. Because I think, this is the last thing I'll say, I'm sorry to wind on so long, but the last thing I'd say is that, it's important to remember when you look at, as I said, a vicious terrorist group like Hamas, is that, it has military capabilities which have been severely degraded by Israel over the course of the last year, but it's also a movement and an idea. And in my experience, the only way you kill an idea is with a better idea, with not only security for Israelis, but a sense of hope for Palestinians as well. And so keeping in view, as we look at the past year and look ahead at the next year, that question of the day after is really, really important, I think, if everything we've seen over the last year is eventually going to lead to at least the possibility of a more stable region, which, is a lot easier said than done in all the years that I've spent working in and on the Middle East.
There have been some signals from the president of Iran, Iran's new president, that he may be a little bit more interested in stability than his predecessor. I'm just curious, given sort of what's happened with Hezbollah, given what's happened with Hamas, and how in many ways they're scrambling right now and their leadership is in hiding, what's left of their leadership is in hiding. Are you sensing or assessing any change in tone from Iran or Iran's intentions to continue to use the Houthis or others to sow instability in the region?
I mean, the ultimate decision maker in the Iranian system is the supreme leader, and I haven't detected, nor have my colleagues detected, any kind of dramatic change of tone there too. I think President Pezeshkian, the newly elected president, is obviously preoccupied with the economy as well, and can understand the risks that Iran runs if this conflict expands. So, we have to be mindful of, all the different perspectives that you see, the Iranian regime. In my experience over the years, and I got most of my gray hair negotiating with Iranians and the secret talks that we did a little more than a decade ago on the nuclear issue. Mm-hmm. Very complicated, and oftentimes a very lethal regime to try to deal with. So you're right, there are a lot of different perspectives, but I think it's a regime that is singularly committed to taking on Israel and taking on the United States in different ways. I don't mean in purely military terms, and has used proxies throughout the region for decades now. But what they face is what is the reality that over the last couple of weeks, the Israelis have done enormous damage to their leading proxy, the most potent proxy that that Iran has been able to field.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you assess that neither Israel or Iran wants this to escalate into full-blown war. What are the things that you worry about the most that might push the region in that direction, regardless of what they want?
Misjudgments that leaders oftentimes make in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. The stuff happens category, where what people think is a precise, targeted, military action ends up producing, lots of casualties. So, the Middle East is a place where complicated stuff happens all the time. It's a place where pessimists always feel right at home. So, you can see the potential for inadvertent collisions, misunderstandings, actions that take on a life of their own. And I think that's the challenge, for the president and for policymakers on the U.S. side to help navigate over the course of the next few weeks.
Mm-hmm. How is your relationship with Mossad these days?
Well, I certainly spend a lot of time talking to my counterpart, David Barnea, who's the Mossad director, an extraordinary professional. We spent a lot of time over most of the last 10 months trying to negotiate a ceasefire and hostage deal. And I have a great deal of respect for his commitment to that issue. We spend a lot of time talking to one another.
Yeah. All right. I want to go a little deeper into some of these issues with you. And sure. We are here in Sea Island, which is obviously a beautiful location. It was also the location in 2004 where President Bush attended a G8 summit. Mm-hmm. And there was a beautiful picture taken on the beach from that. I just want to ask you, what happened to Vladimir Putin?
Well, he's gotten a little puffier since that picture. I think, while I'm not a fatalist, about the way in which U.S.-Russian relations have worsened, certainly since that photo. Yes. I found Putin over the years, over the 20 or 25 years at least that I've had interactions with him, to have, as I said before, a fixation on Ukraine, on controlling it and its choices. I think, at least from my perspective, Vladimir Putin has been unable to see Russia as a great power unless it controls Ukraine. He's been unable to see himself as a great Russian leader without achieving that. And so, he's had a determination on that issue, which didn't necessarily have to unfold in exactly the way it did in February of 2022. Mm-hmm. But I think it reflected that absolute and often ruthless determination on his part. He saw that as his window, his strategic opportunity. Mm-hmm. He thought that European leaders were distracted for a whole variety of reasons. He thought that he really believes, and I've heard him say this a number of times, including in that early November of 21 visit to Moscow, that Ukraine's not a real country. And I think he was convinced that the Ukrainian leadership would just kind of roll over in the path of a Russian military, which he believed he had modernized to the point where it could take on that challenge easily. He thought he had sanctions-proofed the Russian economy by that point. And he was wrong on all of those things. The Ukrainians responded with a fierce determination and remarkable courage. I remember president sent me to talk to President Zelensky a few weeks before the war began, when, I think for understandable reasons, he was still a little bit uncertain about at least what the magnitude and scale of the invasion was going to be. But you could see even at that point, his absolute determination, that he was going to stay and fight, and he took the best punch, uncoordinated in many ways and ineffective as it was from the Russian military in their first few days, and he was still standing. And he provided an inspiration to Ukrainians at that point that few other leaders I've ever known in the course of the nearly 40 years I've been in public service have ever provided. He still has a huge challenge ahead of him, but hence the importance, as I said before, of us continuing to provide all the support we can.
As determined as President Zelensky is to defend and protect his country, you also mentioned that Vladimir Putin is incredibly determined to take back Ukraine and make it part of Russia. Is he determined enough in your assessment? I love using that word with the CIA director.
Yes.
Is he determined enough to use a nuclear weapon?
There have been moments when he saber rattles a lot, and, Russia's the only other nuclear power in the world today, at least, comparable to the United States. So, we can't take that lightly or just kind of lightly dismiss it. On the other hand, I think we have to be really careful not to be unnecessarily intimidated by that too, because I think Putin has a very healthy regard for what it would mean not just to use a nuclear weapon and the consequences of that, not just from the United States, but more widely across the international community, but also the consequences of taking on a NATO country as well, too. So as I said, it's part of our job is to carefully assess that particular risk. But as I said, I at least believe we have to also be very careful not to be unnecessarily intimidated by it, too.
A lot of the experts we have in the room, and a lot of them have worked with you over the years and hold you in the absolute highest regard. It's been very exciting.
Yeah. Those of you who put up with me over the years. Yeah.
We've been talking a lot over the last 2 days about Ukraine, about Russia, and about China. And I wonder how you would characterize the relationship between China and Russia today. Where are the vulnerabilities there as well?
Well, I think first it would be a huge mistake for us at CIA and the U.S. government or, anyone watching that relationship to underestimate the strength of the partnership right now. The sort of personal relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, their sense of shared determination to undermine an international order that the United States has played a very large role in helping to shape. I think China has done more than anyone else to help Putin rebuild his defense industrial base over the last 18 months, not as far as we can assess now, crossing a line with the direct provision of weapons and munitions to Russia for use in the war in Ukraine, but everything short of that in terms of microelectronics, in terms of dual-use items as well, which have been crucial to Putin's success, so far at least, in rebuilding his defense industrial base. So I wouldn't underestimate the strength of that relationship. Now, people will rightly point out that there's historical mistrust, between Chinese and Russians. Russians chafed at being seen as the junior partner of the United States right after the end of the Cold War. Russians, in my experience, and I spent 6 years of my life living there as a diplomat, in my experience, Russians are also eventually going to chafe at being China's junior partner too. But in the meantime, I would not underestimate the bond, the strategic bond that joins them together right now.
Yeah. I would think one of the most challenging, but also one of the most exciting things that you must be looking at the moment is the development of technology and how it's impacting how your workforce does its job. How are you thinking big picture? I think we've been talking again here about the impact of AI, how adversaries are using AI. How is it affecting what you do?
Oh, it's going to have a huge impact. I think nothing is going to shape our future at CIA as an intelligence service more than how well or how poorly we master emerging technologies. For CIA, emerging technologies are both a tool and a target. A tool in the sense that, we have to take advantage of the pace of innovation in new technologies for everything from the way in which we communicate covertly, the way in which we are able to make use of big data so that we can discern patterns in the movement of adversarial intelligence officers and their assets better than they can do the same to us. For our analysts, artificial intelligence, large language models are increasingly important to help human analysts digest the vast amount of open source information and clandestinely acquired information that's out there. That's not going to replace human analysts, but it's going to enable them so they can focus on the questions that I think only the best human analysts can judge. And the same for our operations officers, too. How you navigate smart cities and intense surveillance systems, biometric data. Those are big challenges. But, as I travel around the world, and I've taken more than 80 trips overseas, I think, in the 3.5 years I've been director, I constantly see evidence, even in the most difficult of places to operate, of the ingenuity of our officers, supported by headquarters, and the way in which we're using emerging technologies in a very effective way. People have speculated for, the last decade or two that, advances in technology are going to replace human intelligence. Right. I think it's going to revolutionize the practice of human intelligence, but it's not going to change the fact that at our core at CIA, we are a human intelligence service. But it just means that we have to master that interplay between human beings and new technologies.
Like some of the ways that the agency has been working on that as well have been pretty innovative. One of them, the Cipher Brief did a story on recently about how you're trying to recruit Russians to cooperate with the CIA, Russian agents, using social media. How's that going?
Oh, it's going pretty well, actually. In the sense that this really is, the last 3 years or so, or a once-in-a-generation opportunity to recruit Russians, in the sense that there has been a fair amount of disaffection with, Putin's conduct of the war. And so we're taking full advantage of it. We really are, as, I don't know if Dave Marlowe's here, one of my former colleagues who said we're open for business. And I would add to that, business is pretty good. So not just as a result of those 3, videos that we put out on Telegram, which is a channel that's still watched by, or accessed by half the Russian population. And each of the 3, and I paid careful attention to them, given my own experience in Russia, and I've been really impressed with the quality and the nuance and everything else. And it has produced results. And alongside those results, in terms of what the purpose of this is, it has thoroughly pissed off my Russian counterparts, too, the head of their services, which in itself is probably worth the effort that we've made.
We have several, actually, former Moscow station chiefs with us in this room. And yesterday we had a briefing from the former Prime Minister of Bulgaria, who's actually here with us as well tonight, who gave us sort of a lesson, if you will, and put up maps because that's easier for people like me to follow. But it was really compelling when he showed sort of how Russian operations in the region. And then he talked a little bit more about how Russia is using information operations to influence in those particular states. What is the CIA's role when it comes to sort of countering those information operations?
Well, both information operations where, our initial role is to work with foreign partners to understand them and to be able to map them and see, the ways in which the Russian services are unfolding those kind of operations, because that's the only way in which you can disrupt them is to first understand, what's unfolding in front of you. There are also, beyond information operations, over the course of recent months, there have been a series of sabotage operations as well, aimed by the Russian services largely to try to undermine support for Ukraine in Europe and potentially even in the United States as well. And so there again, we have a really important responsibility to be able to understand what's coming at us and then figure out ways to disrupt it.
Yeah, no small task for sure. I would like to just kind of put everybody in warning. We are going to come to the audience for questions in just about 5 minutes. So if you want to go ahead and we'll get the microphones ready. I'm curious, let me think. Gosh, there's so many things I've been thinking about this for a whole year, as I mentioned, that I wanted to ask you. We've talked about Iran. We've talked about Russia. We've talked about China. How seriously are you taking the threat of North Korea, and especially this new alliance that we're seeing form? And then I want to talk to you about our own alliances.
Yeah, well, I think on North Korea, I think one of the more troubling developments, as you just look at the last year or so, has been the strengthening of the defense partnership between North Korea and Russia, with the North Koreans supplying significant quantities of artillery munitions for Russia, desperately needed by the Russians on the battlefield, short-range ballistic missiles as well. And of course, the challenge is this is a two-way street, because the North Koreans benefit as well from this. Something we watch very carefully. They're using some of their short-range missiles on the battlefield in Ukraine. That's a way to improve, problems in their systems, which ultimately creates real threats and challenges for our treaty allies in Japan and in South Korea, as well as for our own forces too. So, no, that's not something we take lightly at all. We stay very focused on the potential threat and the real threat posed by North Korea.
I'm very concerned, as are many people in the room here, about how we're seeing the alliances shape up today. Mm-hmm. You were just recently in London with your colleague from MI6 over there. Talk to me a little bit about why you did that. You don't do a lot of public appearances, but why you chose to do that one and the message you were trying to get across.
Well, Richard Moore and I, who's the head of MI6 of SIS, is a friend and someone I respect a lot. And we talked about this a good bit. Mm-hmm. I think both of us feel a responsibility in democracies to be able to, within reason, demystify a little bit of what intelligence is all about, and also to highlight the importance of the closest partnerships we have. How we can complement one another, how we can accomplish things together. One example was the run-up to the war in Ukraine, where it was pretty lonely for a while, because it was really only us and SIS, our UK counterparts, who were convinced that an invasion was coming. Most of the rest of our European allies, for whom I also have great respect, mainly thought it was a bluff and this wasn't going to be a serious threat. So for all those reasons, I think it was valuable to do, and it was fun too. Yeah. And you can't, it's a genuine friendship, and so you can't fake that when you're sitting on a stage. And so I hope that came across to people too.
Yeah. I was in London at the same time and very sad that I didn't get the invitation.
You should have asked.
Yeah. I should have asked. Yes, that's right. A very popular trend in the last couple of years has been a policy decision, but something that affects you, and that is the declassification of intelligence in order to share. Do you think this is a trend that will continue, and does it need to? Because another huge theme here has been telling the American people what they need to know about national security. That's a big component.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, in the run-up to the war in Ukraine and as the war was beginning, I think the president was exactly right in the very careful declassification of some of our secrets, because I had watched Putin too many times over the years create false narratives, false flag operations to try to blame the Ukrainians for provoking conflict, which we had a very hard time catching up with. So in this case, the roles were reversed a little bit. Now, Washington, in my experience, is a town in which people think anything worth doing is worth overdoing. Yeah. So you got to be careful, because the surest way to lose good sources of intelligence is to overdo it too. But I think right now the president has gotten this exactly right in terms of those relatively rare instances where we've used that technique.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to share. Do we have questions from the audience? Okay, whole bunch right here in the middle, and you guys can see back there better than I can. Please, if you don't mind, just tell us quickly who you are as well.
Yes, of course. Hi, Director Burns. Katie Bo-Lillis with CNN.
Hi.
Wanted to ask, in this sort of extremely high moment of tension in the Middle East, obviously, fears over mission creep in Lebanon, concerns that Israel may attempt to even strike nuclear facilities inside of Iran. How much is Benjamin Netanyahu listening to the concerns of this administration? And beyond that, as you are sort of thinking about Israel's expected response here to what happened last week. What is, without asking you to predict the future, what's the potential What's the potential outcome of the two biggest issues of concern, right? A strike on a nuclear facility or a strike on oil facilities?
Well, I've learned over the years not to, while part of our job is to try to understand what's coming, is not to make predictions like that too. I mean, I think, the Israeli leadership is weighing very carefully, how it's going to respond to the most recent Iranian ballistic missile attack on Israel. And, the president's made clear that we entirely understand and respect Israel's right to defend itself and to respond. But how it does, just as you suggested, is really important. So I'm not going to predict exactly, how this is going to unfold. And to answer the first part of your question, I do think the Israeli leadership takes into account the concerns that get expressed from the president and senior policymakers on our side as well. And I certainly spend a lot of time talking to my intelligence counterparts over the course of the past year, not just about this issue, but on a range of other ones as well.
We have another one right here, Sue. So
Okay,
I'm just gonna
sounds good.
Thank you very much. Sir, Olivia Gazis with CBS News. Have you or your analysts seen any indication to date that the Supreme Leader is considering giving a green light to weaponization? And are you confident that we and our partner services would detect such a decision in adequate time to forestall nuclear escalation is one. And secondly, there are reports today that Yahya Sinwar has resurfaced and sent some messages to Qatari interlocutors. What are the chances, if he's indeed back in the mix, that he returns to the negotiating table? And do you think that you could close on a Gaza ceasefire deal before you have to leave your post?
Boy, I certainly hope so. This has been, since the success, as I mentioned before, that my negotiating partners and the rest of us had at the end of last year in securing the release of about 100 hostages, it has been pushing a very big rock up a very steep hill. We've come close at least a couple of times, but it's been very elusive. So I very much hope that, we'll be able to pivot from, what is currently an extremely risky environment dominated by military actions to one in which, people in the region in particular see the possibility of doing a deal, a diplomatic arrangement to help produce a ceasefire in South Lebanon, on Israel's northern border, and on Gaza, a ceasefire and hostage deal across Israel's southern border as well. I think, as I said before, given the human stakes in the second issue, I think it's enormously important. And the President has made clear that all of us will continue to do everything we can with our eyes wide open about the challenges, because I've learned not to get my hopes up on this issue over the course of the last year, but with a real determination. Given the fact that when I meet with hostage families, it's not only heartbreaking, but it's also inspiring, given the depth of their commitment to their loved ones as well. And so the least we can do is work as hard as we can to try to produce that. On the first part of the question on Iran and the nuclear program, no, we do not see evidence today that the Supreme Leader has reversed the decision that he took at the end of 2003 to suspend the weaponization program. There are three legs to the Iranian nuclear program's stool, in a sense. I mean, one is, means of delivery, ballistic missile systems. And here the Iranians clearly have made a great deal of progress in recent years, even though the Israelis, with our help, have been able to defeat the two very large-scale ballistic missile attacks on Israel. Second is the ability to amass enriched material, particularly the ability to quickly move to weapons-grade enriched material. And there, since the U.S. pulled out of the Comprehensive Nuclear Agreement, Iran is in a much closer position to produce a bomb's worth of enriched material for a single weapon. During the time the JCPOA was in effect, it would have taken more than a year to do that. Now it's probably more like a week or a little more to produce one bomb's worth of weapons-grade material. So, the risks have increased. But to answer your question, no, we don't see evidence today that such a decision has been made. We watch it very carefully. I think we're reasonably confident that working with our friends and allies, we will be able to see it relatively early on. But the great risk now, the great danger in a way, is that time frame has been compressed in ways which, create huge challenges for us.
Does someone have the mic already? Okay.
Hi, Gary Ross. I work with Greg Vogel, Professor Greg Vogel at the Bush School.
I had a great time seeing him at the Bush School, to see Professor Vogel in action.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm the director of the intelligence program up at the DC campus.
Great.
So looking back, it's been about 20 years since the DNI stood up. So I was wondering if you can comment on some of the successes that we've had over the past 20 years with DNI and maybe some of the remaining challenges in the community after the reshuffling.
I have huge respect for, my friend and partner, Avril Haines, who's the current DNI as well. And I think, we have a very strong personal relationship as well. And I think, the DNI, when ODNI was created, as you well know, it was, in large part in the wake of 9/11 and, with a very sharp focus on ensuring coordination across the intelligence community. And I think in that it has largely succeeded. It's always a very complicated process. And, and my agency obviously, has a great deal of pride in what we do and protecting, our freedom of action. But I think the current partnership is a really strong one. And it's the same I saw, for example, when Jim Clapper was DNI as well, someone who I also have, great respect and admiration for. So I think it's working, if that's the question.
We have one in the back, I think, as well.
Dan Duluth from NBC News. Two questions. One, how do you see the role of the countries in the Persian Gulf, or the U.S. partners and allies there, and how they view the current tense situation, and how much is there a risk that they will come under attack from Iran as the situation unfolds? And then the other question is, given what's happened to Hezbollah, and given the results of these 2 missile attacks on Israel, is it time to perhaps assess Iran's military capabilities, and have they turning out to be less than advertised in the same way that Russia's military capabilities turned out to be not quite what we expected?
Yeah, I think, as I said before, on the last part of your question, Dan, I think the Israelis, with our support, it was a combination, I think, of good intelligence as well as strong integrated air defense, did successfully defeat the 2 very large-scale ballistic missile attacks that the Iranians have conducted. I think in some ways that did expose some of the limitations in Iranian military capabilities, but that's not to suggest that those capabilities are still not quite potent and, something that not only Israel but the United States needs to take very seriously too. So, and what was the first part of your question, Dan? I'm sorry. Yeah, I travel a good deal to the Gulf and, have watched over many years the strengthening of the partnerships between the United States and the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, and spend a lot of time working with the Qataris, with Sheikh Mohammed, the Qatari Prime Minister, on the hostage ceasefire talks as well. I think we have a deep stake in their security. I think you see increasing collaboration with the Emirates, for example, in the area of emerging technologies, especially in artificial intelligence as well. And I think there's the potential to do even more together with them. So, we take a very strong interest in their security. I think they understand that. Of course, they're troubled by the potential for Iranian threats. They're not interested in seeing an all-out conflict emerge, but I think the way in which the United States continues to position itself, the U.S. military and the U.S. intelligence community in the region and the Gulf, I think reassures them that, we understand those security concerns and we're committed to doing everything we can to help them address them successfully.
I think we have time for about 2 more.
Good evening, Director Burns.
Hey.
Michael Stokes with Ridgeline International. I'm a retired case officer.
Nice to
and
see
so
you.
thank you for
Thanks
your service.
for your service. Yeah.
Pivoting slightly, you had said early in your career that ubiquitous technical surveillance was one of the most strategic threats facing CIA. Do you still feel that way? And if so, what have you done about it? And if not, what's changed that has allowed you to pivot on that thought?
I still do. I think it's one of the biggest challenges that we face as a human intelligence service, as I mentioned earlier. I think we're doing a lot, at the farm and in ways in which we think about that phenomenon, that threat, and the way in which we can successfully navigate through it. It's changed in many significant ways the way in which we have to operate in a lot of very intense, ubiquitous technical surveillance environments. But I think we're learning fast, we're innovating. It's something I take great pride in at the agency, and I know my colleagues do too. And as I said before, the challenge for us is to be able to navigate UTS systems at least as well and hopefully better than our adversaries and rivals do. And I think while I would never be complacent or overconfident about that, I think today we're pointed in a good direction, and I think we just need to continue to move faster, certainly faster than our rivals and adversaries do. But I am confident that, since, as I said, at our core, we're a human intelligence service, that we're going to be able to sustain that in ways that serve, American security interests.
Director Burns, I'm Eamon Javers with CNBC.
Hi.
Last week, we saw the president talking about the prospect of an Iranian a strike on Iranian oil fields. We saw oil markets move pretty sharply on that in real time. So I wonder if you can tell us.
You're going to try to get me this evening to add to a spike in oil.
or a sharp decline. News is news either way. So. I would like to get your sense of an assessment of just how likely an event that is, and if you can give us any color at all on what the United States has told the Israelis about whether or not that would be a good idea.
Yeah, and I'm honestly not going to go beyond what the president has said and conveyed or add anything to that at all. I think all of us are acutely aware of the potential consequences of different forms of strikes. And consequences for the global energy market and the global economy too. So I am not going to feed that argument this evening.
Okay, I want to take the last few minutes and
Sure.
just get personal, if we can, for a moment. One of your predecessors, General David Petraeus, was here with us yesterday, who, of course, had a really very strategically amazing career at DoD, had several commands. He said that when he became director of CIA, he thought he knew some stuff before, but that his eyes were opened to the threats that he just really, hadn't been tracking in the same way. Did you have a similar experience?
Yeah, I did. I spent 3.5 decades as a career diplomat. I, served very closely with CIA friends and officers, especially serving overseas too. So I thought I knew the agency, but it's a lot different than when you're actually a part of it too. But honestly, I not only love my job and have, increasingly as every month, as every year has gone by, but I take enormous pride in, what our officers can do to understand emerging threats and, help the president deal with them too. So, I learn something new every day, that's for sure. But that's a large part of why I love the job so much. It's my curiosity and learning new things, but it's also just the pride I take in working with such a remarkable group of women and men.
Yeah. I've been thinking all day about how to ask this question, and I don't want to ask it in this way, the what keeps you up at night question, but I can't think of another way to say it. So, we've talked about so many of the things. You're such a calm, cool, collected professional. Does anything really make you nervous?
Sure. Yeah, no, ask my family, yeah. No, there's a certain amount of interrupted sleep comes with the territory in a job like this one. What keeps me up at night, honestly, is the fact that, I'm concerned, about my officers, about our officers, doing very hard jobs in very hard places around the world. And that is not a reflection of any doubt about their professional skill or their judgment, none at all. It's just a reflection of the fact that we don't have a risk-free environment in which to operate. I can help my colleagues anticipate risk, help mitigate it. I can't make it go away. So that's something that weighs on me too. The question about what keeps me up at night, I mean, quite literally, was an experience I had about a year ago, I guess. I had volunteered, thought it was a great idea at the time, to join the last overnight segment exercise of the Special Operations Training course, SOTC, that our operations officers run just before they do the rest of their operations training course too. This runs from like 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. down in the deep, dark Virginia woods. And it seemed like a great idea till about 3 a.m. when I was wondering whether what I had signed up for. But what was fascinating to me was to see this group of officers just at the very beginning of their careers learn not just the tools of the trade and the basic elements of the profession, but also learn teamwork and learn to rely on one another. Many of these officers had military experiences. Some of what they were doing in these exercises was, not really novel for them, but others didn't. But they contributed just as substantially as anybody else did. But what made this especially interesting is you get to like 4:30 in the morning, and the culmination of this exercise is a Delta team from Fort Liberty, the old Fort Bragg, came up to do a hostage rescue operation. And the scenario they had been told was there's this small group of CIA officers being held captive by a rival power, and they're being led by somebody impersonating a senior CIA officer. So it was worth the price of admission to see the look on the face of this incredibly impressive young Army major coming up the stairs to see a real live CIA director tied to a chair at the top of it. So that kept me up at night, but it's also one of the many reasons I love this job.
That's a great story. All right. You've been a diplomat, you've done the diplomat thing, and now you've done the spy thing.
Yep.
Which is more fun?
What I do now.
What you do now?
I say that with great affection for
Yeah.
my old institution and my old profession, but as I said, I genuinely love this job.
So I have an award I'm going to present you in just a moment. And I'm going to explain why, because the Cipher Brief started an honors dinner. We had our first one in Washington earlier this year, where we honored several leaders within the national security community. And we're honoring you with the Intelligence and Diplomacy Award. Intelligence and diplomacy are usually not two words that go together, but I would say, based on the last year in particular, you have really defined what this is moving forward. Explain to me, quickly if you will, how you see intelligence diplomacy, and is this something that we're going to see more of in the future?
Well, I think we've seen a lot of it in the past, honestly. It's what, incredible colleagues that I serve with have done for many years in trying to use intelligence relationships to serve the wider U.S. national security interests, too. I think it's especially important in an age in which we're engaged in long-term competition with the People's Republic of China, so I spend a fair amount of my time, when I travel in the Indo-Pacific, to try to work closely with not just intelligence partners, but leaderships as well, not just to offer the insights we can through our intelligence collection on PRC capabilities and intentions, the ways in which they can threaten the interests of our allies and partners, but also what we can do together as well, too, because in an age in which while I would much rather play the hand the United States has been dealt than China's or Russia's or anybody else, we're no longer the only big kid on the geopolitical block. What sets us apart from relatively lonelier powers today, like China or Russia, is we have a network of allies and partners, and that's true in the field of intelligence too. So, one of the reasons that I've done as much overseas traveling as I had, which is one of the big surprises for me. I did not expect that I would be doing that when I started this job nearly 4 years ago. One of the reasons, though, is because, we're in the business of human interactions at CIA. And so being able to deal face-to-face with intelligence partners and foreign leaders and try to build those kind of relationships, the kind you can draw on. For example, CIA was very actively involved in support of the president in the recent Russia prisoner swap that took place. By far the biggest and most complex such swap in the history of not just U.S.-Russia relations, but U.S.-Soviet relations. We it brought out the best, I think. It embodied the best in what CIA does. Quiet, head down professionalism in trying to produce an exchange of 24 human beings involving 7 different countries. And that's the point I'm trying to make. Because, we worked hard at those intelligence partnerships in support of the president's efforts with political leaderships. We could work with Germany, with Poland, with Norway, with Slovenia, with the Turks and the British and others to help pull all this together. And it was incredibly satisfying to be able to see not just, the American citizens who were released, but 7 Russian political prisoners who otherwise, I am convinced, would have died in Russian penal colonies. And that, I think, shows the virtue not just of intelligence diplomacy, but I think what the CIA is capable of in a very short period of time, at the end of this, to try to pull all the different threads together. And that's a function, I think, of us developing those partnerships as well. So that's something we'll remain very committed to.
My last question.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you mentioned the human component of this job, because I think it's important to sort of show humanity in what the intelligence community does. So I was hoping maybe you would share with us a secret about yourself. Did you like the way I did that?
Yes, no, it's a good segue. As a very young diplomat, but it was right at the beginning of my first tour in Jordan many years ago, 40 years ago. I took very seriously, I had studied Arabic before in graduate school, so I figured it would be a really good idea to do kind of an immersion program. My immersion program was a little unusual. It was to spend a month with a Bedouin tribe, the Howeitat, in southern Jordan, right along the Saudi border, which turned out to be great for my Arabic. I learned a lot because there was certainly not an English speaker within, throwing distance there. Fortunately, I think there's a statute of limitations on some of the stuff that went on because basically what the Howeitat did in that era was smuggling back and forth across the Saudi border. Now, not narcotics or weapons, so I can reassure everyone. But, at that time, it was like refrigerators and televisions and things like that. So I was probably an accessory to some of that. And then the other interesting thing, the last thing I'd say about that experience is this was the same tribe which, going back to Lawrence of Arabia and his, conflict against the Turks, had been led by this famous